Great Society speech, the We Shall Overcome speech, the Howard University speech. Anyway, the proudest moment for public life for him, and it was just mentioned in these last days because it was the 55th anniversary of the Selma demonstrations and the great speech that Lyndon Johnson gave that my husband crafted. What happened is after the Selma demonstrations in March of '65, Johnson decided all of a sudden on a Sunday night that he was going to go for voting rights to a joint session of Congress speech the next night. Voting rights was always in his future, but he wanted Medicare and aid to education to come first, and they'd just done the Civil Rights Bill the year before, desegregating the South. But he knew this was the moment to go for it. So my husband had only that day to write that speech. It is the most, if you look it up, it's called the We Shall Overcome speech. It starts out, I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. Every now and then history and fate meet at a certain time in a certain place. So it was in Lexington and Concord, so it was in Appomattox, so it was in Selma, Alabama. This is not a Negro problem, not a white problem, not a Northern problem, not a Southern problem. It's an American problem, and we are met here to meet that problem. And then he says, but even if we get voting rights, there's still a long way to go. But if we come together, and then he takes the anthem of the Civil Rights Movement, we shall overcome. That's when change happens, as I was saying earlier, when the outside movement meets the inside power. And 6 weeks later, the Voting Rights Act passes. And it's the proudest moment in my husband's life. It's a great speech. He's at the height of his power, and he sees the war eating away at the Great Society. And he leaves the White House, and he becomes an anti-war activist. And Bobby was his great friend, and he joins Bobby's campaign. He had written Bobby's South Africa speech, which is on his grave, the Ripples of Hope speech, and he's with Bobby when he dies. But the most important thing he was writing about was to make sure that he said he'd been born during the Depression, he had lived through the early days of World War II, he had been there when Kennedy died, he had been at Bobby's bedside when he died, he'd seen the anti-war movement spiraling out of control, and the main message he wanted to leave was that America is not as fragile as we think. We will get through this. So I would love to finish that if I could for him.
We know you will, and we look forward to reading it. So a final question, I think, to wrap up everything we've been talking about tonight. First and foremost, thank you so much for coming to Green Bay. It's been a wonderful evening. So we do live in divisive and contentious times. We have a presidential election coming up in a few months. So as we look at our divided country and the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead of us, how can books such as the ones you've researched and written, and the work of history in general, help us through these times?
I'd like to believe that what we need to be looking at as we decide who we're voting for, not just for president, but at any level, is they've all usually come from somewhere. Before Tim Russert died, we talked about the fact that the way journalists cover campaigns makes no sense in some ways. They cover debates, who zings who in a debate. These debates have spiraled way out of proportion. That when you become president, you're not going to be debating your opponent day after day. You're going to be making decisions. And you're going to be deciding what kind of qualities are character more important than anything. And so we were talking about the fact that maybe we should be following, they've been leaders before. Everybody's come governor, mayor, senator, business leader, as Trump was. What kind of leaders were they? Maybe it's a magazine article that you might read about that, but we should be talking about that, seeing whether they have humility or empathy or resilience or all the qualities we want, seeing whether they've been able to take responsibility when they failed, seeing whether or not they can admit mistakes. I mean, character is the most important thing we're looking at. And if I could just end by saying that here's Abraham Lincoln, the man who so wanted to be remembered after he died, and if only he had known what would eventually come to be the history understanding of him. I was so excited to find an interview with the great Russian writer Leo Tolstoy to a New York reporter at the turn of the 20th century who had gone to Russia that allowed me to end Team of Rivals with this interview rather than Lincoln's death. I never want to end when they die, because I don't want them to die after living with them for so long. And in it, Tolstoy showed that Lincoln's name had reached a remote corner of Russia, even then, in 1904 or 5. He said he'd just come back from a remote area of the Caucasus where there were a group of wild barbarians who'd never left that part of Russia. They were so excited to have Tolstoy in their midst, they asked him to tell stories of the great men of history. So he said, I told them about Napoleon and Alexander the Great and Frederick the Great and Julius Caesar, and they seemed to love it. But before I finished, the leader of the barbarians stood up and he said, but wait, you haven't told us about the greatest ruler of them all. We want to hear about that man who spoke with the voice of thunder, who laughed like the sunrise, who came from that place called America that is so far from here that if a young man should travel there, he would be an old man when he arrived. Tell us of that man, tell us of Abraham Lincoln. Tolstoy was stunned to know Lincoln's name had reached this far, but he told them everything he could about Lincoln, and then the reporter said to him, so what made Lincoln so great after all? And Tolstoy said, well, he was probably not as great a general as Napoleon, not as great a statesman as Frederick the Great, but his greatness consisted in the moral fiber of his being and his character, the ultimate standard for judging our leaders, and that's what we have to look at right now as we face this election.